You are not weak. You are not broken. What you feel right now, the weight you carry in silence, the restless need that seems to dominate your life, is not a sign of failure. It is not proof that you are flawed beyond repair. What you are experiencing is pain, and all pain has a story behind it. This distinction matters because when you see yourself only through the lens of weakness, you bury yourself under shame. But when you understand that what you call addiction is actually an echo of something deeper, then a new possibility opens before you. What if the urges that feel bigger than you are not your enemy, but signals pointing you toward a truth you've been avoiding? Imagine for a moment the way people have looked at addiction for centuries. It has been treated as a moral defect, as if the person could simply choose to be different. Families whisper in silence, societies point fingers, and even the addict begins to believe the lie that they are broken. Yet, Carl Jung, one of the greatest explorers of the human soul, saw through this illusion. In his letters, in his work, in the lives he touched, Jung insisted that addiction was never just a weakness of will. He described it as a spiritual crisis, a hunger of the soul that had been misdirected. For him, the bottle, the pill, the screen, the habit were not the core problem. They were substitutes, failed attempts to answer a longing that every human carries. Think of the moments when your cravings feel strongest. Beneath them, isn't there an emptiness, a restlessness, a desire to escape a silence you cannot bear? Jung believed this was the soul crying out for meaning. Instead of condemning the addict, he saw in them a seeker, someone desperately trying to touch the sacred, but trapped in substitutes that never satisfy. This perspective does not excuse the damage of addiction, but it reframes the struggle. It says, you are not sick beyond hope, you are searching for something real, and you have simply been searching in the wrong places. If you let this idea settle, you may already feel a shift. What if your battle is not against yourself, but against the misunderstanding of what your suffering means? What if the compulsion that haunts you is not proof of your weakness, but proof of your depth? Beneath the behavior lies a calling, and the calling is simple. Find what your soul is truly asking for. This is where we begin. Not with judgment, not with shame, not with the empty promises of quick cures. We begin with recognition. You are not broken. You are in pain. And pain, no matter how heavy, has an origin. In this journey we will walk together, we will uncover those roots. We will see why the wound exists, how it has shaped you, and how it can become the doorway to transformation. The path is not easy, but it is real, and today it begins. When Carl Jung wrote to Bill Wilson, the man who would go on to co-found Alcoholics Anonymous, he did not speak in the clinical language of disorders and treatments. Instead, he wrote with a kind of blunt clarity that pierced straight through the surface. To Jung, addiction was not merely a matter of poor choices or weak will, it was something far deeper. He called it spiritus contra spiritum, the true spirit at war with the false spirit. This phrase, at once poetic and devastating, reframed the problem entirely. It suggested that the thirst for alcohol or drugs or any compulsive behavior was in fact a distorted thirst for transcendence. Behind the bottle was a longing for the divine. Behind the high was a hunger for connection with something infinite. Imagine how radical this must have sounded at the time. In an era where alcoholics were dismissed as hopeless cases and moral failures, Jung dared to suggest that what drove them was not depravity but spirituality. He believed the alcoholic was seeking, in liquid form, a substitute for mystical experience. The glass was not simply an escape, it was a counterfeit chalice, a desperate attempt to feel what the soul already knew it needed: ecstasy, relief, peace, communion. What if every addict you have ever seen, including perhaps yourself, was not chasing chaos for its own sake, but chasing a glimpse of the sacred in disguise? This idea changes everything. If addiction is a misguided spiritual quest, then the addict is not just a patient, not just a problem, but a pilgrim lost along the way. Their compass is broken, their path corrupted, but their longing is real. Think of how this reframing shifts the emotional weight. Instead of seeing the addict as shameful, you see them as human, aching, searching, vulnerable to substitutes, because the real thing feels so out of reach. And isn't that in some sense all of us? Who has not reached for something temporary to soothe a deeper ache? The addict's story is only an intensified version of a universal truth. Jung's phrase, spiritus, contra spiritum, captures the paradox perfectly. On one side, the true spirit, the authentic connection to the self, to meaning, to God, to whatever name you give to the eternal. On the other side, the false spirit, the drink, the drug, the compulsion, the distraction. One promises transcendence, but delivers emptiness. The other is harder, slower, more demanding, but it leads to wholeness. Addiction is the soul's tragic confusion between the two. Pause for a moment and reflect on your own cravings, whatever form they take. Is it really the substance, the behavior, the object you want? Or is it the feeling it promises? Relief. Release. A brief disappearance of the void. Jung would say, you are not addicted to the drink or the pill or the screen. You are addicted to the illusion of transcendence they offer. And the more you drink from that false cup, the thirstier you become, because it never delivers what it promises. This is why addiction cannot be reduced to lectures about willpower or moral condemnation. The struggle is not against weakness, but against misdirection. The addict is trying to ascend, but the ladder they climb leans against the wrong wall. To treat addiction as simply a failure is to miss the truth that within it lies a sacred impulse, warped but still alive. That impulse is the soul's longing to return home. So when Jung wrote to Bill Wilson, he was not offering mere sympathy. He was pointing to a truth that would form the foundation of Alcoholics Anonymous itself, the recognition that recovery is not just about abstinence, but about spiritual awakening. Without a real encounter with meaning, the false spirit will always win. Only when the thirst is redirected toward the true source can the war end. And this opens a question for you, one that lingers in the quiet corners of your heart. What is it you are really seeking? Beneath the compulsion, beneath the escape, what is the sacred experience you crave? Until you answer that, the cycle continues. But if you dare to look, if you dare to name it, then the false spirit begins to lose its grip. Because the truth is, your longing is not the problem. The problem is only where you have been searching. When Gabor Maté, the Hungarian-Canadian physician who spent decades working with some of society's most marginalized addicts, was asked the question that so many people ask, why the addiction? He gave an answer that shifted the entire frame. The real question, he said, is not why the addiction, but why the pain. In those few words, he reframed addiction not as a moral failure, not even as a primary problem, but as a response, a survival strategy born out of wounds that never had a chance to heal. Addiction, in this light, is not the disease itself. It is the bandage. It is the anesthesia chosen when nothing else seemed to soothe. Maté spent years among people most of the world had abandoned: homeless men and women, lifelong drug users, people whose faces bore the lines of endless struggle. He did not see them as hopeless cases. He saw their stories, and in every single one he found pain. Some carried memories of brutal abuse, of nights when childhood innocence was shattered. Others had no one to protect them, growing up in homes where neglect was just as damaging as violence. Even those without extreme trauma still carried wounds of disconnection. Parents too stressed, too cold, too absent to provide the warmth a child's nervous system needs to feel safe. Again and again, he discovered the same truth. Addiction was never random. It was always rooted in a wound. Perhaps you can already sense echoes of this in your own story. Maybe your compulsion is not heroin or alcohol, but something less obvious: endless scrolling, compulsive shopping, the need to bury yourself in work until you collapse. On the surface, these behaviors may look different, but at their core, they serve the same function: to numb, to distract, to fill the gap. If you are honest with yourself, isn't it true that the moments you give in to them are not the moments when you feel strong, but the moments when you feel empty, lonely, unseen? Maté would say, the behavior is never about pleasure. It is about relief. This insight has profound implications, because if addiction is about pain, then shaming the addict is like punishing someone for having a wound. Imagine someone with a broken leg limping down the street, and instead of offering help, people ridicule them for not running. That is how society has treated the addicted, mocking the limp, ignoring the fracture. But the fracture is real, and until it is addressed, the limp will remain. The substance, the compulsion, the distraction, these are simply the crutches people learn to lean on. What makes Maté's perspective so human, so compassionate, is that it strips away the illusion of difference. You don't have to be a heroin user on the streets of Vancouver to recognize yourself in this. How many times have you reached for your phone, not because you truly wanted connection, but because you were avoiding silence? How many times have you eaten, not out of hunger, but out of loneliness? How many times have you drowned yourself in work, not because you loved it, but because it was easier than facing what waited for you in stillness? These are not random habits. They are signals of the same dynamic: avoiding pain. And so the question changes. Instead of asking, "Why can't I stop?" the real question becomes, "What am I running from?" This shift matters because it softens the voice of judgment and awakens the voice of curiosity. Instead of branding yourself as weak, you can begin to ask, what is this behavior protecting me from feeling? What wound is it trying to cover? And if you listen long enough, you may find that the answer points back to moments of disconnection, moments when love was absent, when safety was missing, when you were forced to carry more than you should have had to bear. Seen this way, addiction is not the enemy. It is the evidence of your survival. The drink, the drug, the binge, the distraction, they were ways your nervous system tried to protect you when no one else did. This does not mean they are harmless, but it does mean they make sense. They are the language of pain expressed in behavior. And when you see them that way, something changes. Compassion begins to replace shame. Curiosity replaces condemnation. Healing becomes possible because you are finally asking the right question. So the next time you notice yourself drawn toward that familiar habit, pause. Ask not me, why can't I control this, but what am I trying not to feel right now? It may be loneliness, it may be fear, it may be a memory you don't want to touch. Whatever it is not weakness, it is pain. And pain, once acknowledged, can begin to heal. Addiction was never about the substance, it was about the wound beneath it, waiting for your attention. Carl Jung often warned that the greatest danger to any human being is not what lies outside of them, but what lies hidden within. He called it the shadow, the collection of fears, desires, shames, and wounds we learn to bury because we believe they are unacceptable. The shadow is made up of everything you have been told not to be, everything you decided must stay hidden if you were to be loved, accepted, or safe. Yet what is repressed does not disappear. It lingers beneath the surface, shaping your thoughts, your emotions, your choices, often without you realizing. And in the case of addiction, it demands expression through compulsive behaviors, through the relentless search for relief that never satisfies. Think of the child who grows up learning that anger is dangerous. They swallow it down, bury it deep, but it does not dissolve. Years later, that same anger resurfaces in destructive forms, explosions, sabotage, or the numbing embrace of alcohol. Think of the young girl who learns that her vulnerability is a weakness. She learns to armor herself, to present strength to the world, but inside she feels fragile, disconnected, craving something to fill the emptiness. Compulsions become the pressure valve, the way the unconscious keeps from shattering under the weight of unprocessed emotions. This is the essence of the shadow. What you refuse to face does not vanish. It finds its way out, often in ways that feel beyond your control. Jung captured this truth in a single line. What you do not make consciously manifests in your life as fate. Consider how haunting that is. The very things you fear, deny, or ignore will return, disguised as bad luck, recurring patterns, or addictions you swear you will never repeat. How many times have you promised yourself, never again, only to find yourself pulled back by a force you cannot explain? This is not a weakness of will. It is the shadow pulling the strings from behind the curtain. Addiction, in this sense, is not simply about substances or habits. It is the shadow demanding passage. It is your unconscious saying, "You cannot hide me forever." The drink becomes a way to drown the shame you never faced. The compulsive relationship becomes a reenactment of the abandonment you never resolved. The endless scrolling becomes a distraction from the loneliness you refuse to name. Each compulsion is the shadow knocking on the door, reminding you that until you confront what lies beneath, you will never truly be free. Jung believed that every shadow is born from the split between who we are and who we believe we are allowed to be. From childhood, we learn to repress parts of ourselves to earn love or safety. The sensitive child learns to stop crying. The angry child learns to silence rage. The curious child learns to hide their desires. But the psyche does not forget. These rejected parts become the shadow, waiting in the darkness for recognition. And until they are recognized, they emerge as compulsions, as obsessions, as addictions that feel stronger than our conscious will. Pause for a moment and ask yourself, what have you buried? What parts of yourself have you locked away because you believed they were too ugly, too shameful, too dangerous to show the world? Could it be that the very urges you fight against are only those repressed parts trying to speak? If you look honestly, you may see that your addiction is not random. It is patterned. It is tied to the things you have refused to feel, the memories you have pushed aside, the emotions you have numbed. Addiction is the language of the shadow, speaking in behaviors because it cannot yet speak in words. The tragedy is that so many people spend their entire lives fighting the symptom while ignoring the cause. They wage war on the bottle, on the pill, on the urge, never realizing that what they are really fighting is themselves. They think they are battling an enemy, but the enemy is only their own neglected self, the parts of them that were never welcomed into the light. Jung did not see the shadow as evil. He saw it as unlived life, as energy that had been turned against itself. The task was not to destroy it, but to integrate it. Only then could the compulsions lose their grip. And this is why healing requires courage. To heal from addiction is to dare to descend into the shadow, to open the door you have spent years locking shut. It means facing the anger, the shame, the grief, the desire you have tried to bury. It means realizing that what you thought would destroy you might actually be the key to your wholeness. It is not an easy descent, but it is the only path to freedom. So ask yourself again, what are you hiding? What is trying to surface through your compulsions? Because until you face it, you will remain trapped in the cycle. But when you find the strength to enter the shadow, you discover something extraordinary. The monster you feared is not here to devour you, it is here to lead you home. And in the next step of this journey, we will see just how deep those roots go and why trauma and the inner child are at the very center of every addiction. Before there was addiction, there was a child who did not choose their circumstances, who learned too early that the world was not always safe. Long before the first drink, the first pill, the first compulsive escape, there was a nervous system still forming, a heart still tender, a mind absorbing the signals of love or neglect around it. Addiction is not born in adulthood. It is seeded in the early years, in the fragile soil where connection should have taken root, but often did not. Trauma does not always arrive as violence or catastrophe. Sometimes it is the silence that wounds, the absence of comfort at the moment it was needed, the look of disapproval that taught a child they were unworthy, the missing gaze that whispered, "You are invisible." These experiences do not vanish, they etch themselves into the body, shaping how a person will one day cope with pain. When those unhealed wounds remain buried, addiction emerges as a kind of prosthesis, a tool the psyche fashions to survive. Think of the inner child, still alive inside every adult, carrying memories of abandonment and loneliness. That child never disappears. They wait within, and when life overwhelms, when emptiness stirs, it is that child who reaches for comfort. But the child does not know how to ask for healing, only how to seek relief. And so the adult repeats patterns, substances, distractions, compulsions, because the inner child is still crying, "Please make this pain stop." This is why Gabor Maté says the opposite of addiction is not sobriety, but connection. What the addicted person seeks is not simply the high, it is belonging, presence, the feeling of being held. When that is absent in childhood, the nervous system develops in vigilance. The brain learns to expect neglect, to anticipate abandonment, to soothe itself however possible. The adult then seeks substitutes. Alcohol becomes a parent, work becomes a shield, food becomes comfort, the phone becomes companionship. Each one a prosthesis, an attempt to replace what was missing. But these prostheses, while useful in the moment, are fragile. They offer temporary relief at a growing cost. The drink may calm the body, but it erodes the life around it. The compulsive relationship may soothe loneliness, but it deepens dependency. Distractions numb the ache, and the possibility of real connection. Quick fixes promise peace, but leave the root untouched. Until the root is faced, the cycle continues. Healing cannot be found in climbing upward while pretending the past does not exist. Jung's haunting truth stands. No tree grows to heaven unless its roots reach down to hell. The descent into darkness is not punishment, it is necessity. To heal, one must be willing to return to the pain of the inner child, to sit with the memories that have long been avoided, to acknowledge the parts of oneself that were silenced. Imagine walking into a dark basement you have avoided for years. Inside are boxes you never opened, memories, feelings, pieces of yourself. For years you told yourself it was better to keep the door closed, but the mold grew, the air thickened, and the neglect began to poison the rest of the house. This is what happens when we refuse to descend. The unvisited basement becomes the source of suffering, and addiction is the frantic mask. Only by going down, by opening the boxes, by facing what is inside, can the house breathe again. This descent is not easy. It means touching the memories of being left alone, of carrying pain too heavy for a child. It means recognizing that what feels unbearable now was once unbearable then, and your survival strategies, though costly, were born of necessity. Compassion must guide this descent because blame has no power here. You cannot condemn the child for how they survived. You can only thank them for enduring, and then begin to show them a new way. The path of healing requires slowing where once you ran, feeling where once you numbed, listening where once you silenced. It requires holding the hand of that inner child and saying, "You are safe now, I see you, I won't abandon you again." Neuroscience affirms this. The body carries trauma, and only through re-experiencing safety and connection can those circuits rewire. The descent into the wound is not regression, it is reparenting, offering now what was absent then. Here lies the tension everyone on this path must face. Quick fixes are seductive, they offer relief now. True healing is slower, demanding patience and honesty. To go down before going up feels counterintuitive. We want the light without entering the dark. But there is no other way. To ascend toward wholeness, you must pass through the shadows. To grow toward heaven, your roots must touch the places you swore you would never revisit. So consider this. What have you been running from that still waits in the dark? What cries of the child within you remain unanswered? Until you descend, gently, bravely, compassionately, addiction will keep knocking. But when you choose courage, when you open the basement and let air and light in, you discover the darkness you feared was never empty. It was waiting to return you to yourself. Carl Jung once wrote, "No tree grows to heaven unless its roots reach down to hell." At first glance, this sounds terrifying. Why must we descend into darkness to ascend into light? But if you sit with these words, you begin to see their wisdom. Growth is not a straight climb toward the sky. Wholeness is not achieved by denying the depths, but by embracing them. To heal is not to escape pain, but to reconcile with it, to make it part of your strength. For too long, addiction has been framed as a battle to conquer. The language is full of war metaphors: fight your demons, defeat the craving, conquer the weakness. And while this sounds empowering, it secretly betrays us, because when you treat addiction as an enemy, you treat a part of yourself as an enemy. You wage war against your own soul. And in that war, no matter who wins, you lose. Jung's perspective offers another way. Addiction is not an enemy to be destroyed. It is a messenger. It is the unconscious saying, "Look here. This is where it hurts." Think about that for a moment. Every compulsion, every bottle, every distraction, what if it is not weakness but a signal? Addiction then is not meaningless chaos, it is direction. Pain is not random cruelty, it is invitation. When you reframe it this way, your posture changes. Instead of running from the craving, you can ask, what is it asking me to see? What part of me needs healing right now? This is the path of transformation. It does not mean glorifying addiction, nor excusing its damage, but it means respecting the message hidden within it. The alcohol says, "There is grief you have not wept." The endless work says, "There is emptiness you have not named." The distractions point to wounds longing to be seen. When you accept this, you stop seeing yourself as broken and start seeing yourself as called. Jung's psychology was always about integration. To him, the self is not achieved by cutting away parts, but by uniting them, even the dark ones, into a whole. This is why he spoke of shadow work. The parts you disowned, anger, shame, vulnerability, do not vanish. They only wait. Integration means bringing them into the light and allowing them to belong. Addiction points directly to what you have disowned. Healing means welcoming it back. And here lies the reversal that makes transformation possible. For years, you may have believed your compulsion was your enemy, proof of failure, but what if it was your guide? What if the very thing you thought would destroy you was showing you the way home? This is not to romanticize suffering. It is to recognize that suffering carries the seed of growth. The descent into hell is not the end of the story. It is the necessary beginning of rebirth. Consider how trees grow. Their roots do not stop at the surface. They push downward into the dark soil where decay feeds the earth. Only because of that descent can they rise high toward the sun. Your life is no different. Your addiction, your pain, your shadow, these are the roots, and the deeper you face them, the higher you can grow into wholeness. Transformation is not denial of darkness, but the harnessing of it. This path requires courage. It asks you to stop running, to stop numbing, to stop pretending you can skip the descent. It demands that you sit with the discomfort, listen to the craving without obeying it, feel grief without drowning in it, hold shame without letting it define you. It is not about perfection. It is about presence. It is about saying, I will not abandon myself again. I will walk with my pain until it teaches me what I need to learn. And slowly, something shifts. The craving loses its grip, not because you are stronger, but because you are listening. The wound softens, not because it has vanished, but because it is finally acknowledged. The shadow becomes less frightening because it is no longer an intruder. It is part of your story. And little by little you realize that the enemy you fought for so long was only your own forgotten self, waiting for reconciliation. So the question becomes, are you willing to stop fighting yourself and begin listening instead? Because this is where transformation begins. Addiction is not proof of your brokenness, it is proof of your longing for wholeness. The path is painful, yes, it asks you to descend. But remember Jung's words, the tree only rises because its roots have touched the depths, and if you dare to descend, you may discover that the place you feared most was the very ground of your transformation. Rebirth is not a single moment. It is not a clean break where one day you are lost in compulsion and the next day you are free. It is slower, gentler, messier. It happens in small choices, in moments when you respond differently to yourself, in glimpses of presence where once there was only escape. To be reborn is not to erase your past, but to live with it differently, to let your pain shape you into someone wiser, more compassionate, more whole. Carl Jung taught that the soul does not seek perfection but wholeness. This matters because perfection is an illusion that breeds shame. No matter how hard you strive, flaws remain. Wholeness, however, is the courage to embrace every part of yourself, the light and the shadow, the wounds and the wisdom. Healing from addiction is not about becoming spotless. It is about carrying your scars with dignity, letting them remind you of survival, and integrating them into your story. Imagine your life as a shattered vase repaired with gold. The cracks, no longer signs of damage, but the very places of beauty. This is what recovery looks like. Your addiction, your shadow, your trauma are not erased. They become the lines through which light enters. Rebirth begins with presence. No more running, no more silencing the inner child or hiding from the shadow. It begins when you choose to stay, even in discomfort, even in silence, even when the old impulse whispers. It begins when you sit with the craving and, instead of seeing it as an enemy, listen to the message it carries. Every time you choose to listen rather than flee, you are stepping into a new life. Rebirth is also a connection. Remember Maté's words. The opposite of addiction is not sobriety, it is connection. To be reborn is to reconnect with your own body, with your feelings, with others, with meaning, with life itself. Addiction isolates, convincing you that you are alone, that no one understands. Rebirth shows you that you belong to the human story, that your wounds are not marks of exclusion but bridges of empathy. When you let yourself be seen, you discover that others have walked the same path. Healing is not solitary, it is shared. And rebirth is not a finish line. It is not about claiming victory and never struggling again. It is a new posture toward yourself, compassion instead of condemnation, curiosity instead of shame, presence instead of denial. Cravings may return, shadows may rise, but now you know they are part of the journey. You no longer need to run. You can face them, integrate them, and keep walking. Wholeness is not the absence of struggle, but the ability to meet it with open eyes and an open heart. Pause and reflect. You are not your addiction. You are not the repetition of your mistakes. You are the awareness that sees differently. That awareness itself is proof that something new is already being born. Rebirth does not start tomorrow. It begins now, in the willingness to see your pain not as a curse, but as a call. So where do you go from here? The journey will continue with its ups and downs, but you walk it differently now because you know the truth. You are not broken. You are wounded, and wounds can heal. You are not alone. You are part of a larger awakening, a community of people facing their shadows and transforming them into strength. This is why your story matters. When you share it, you give others permission to see themselves too. Your courage becomes a spark for someone else's healing. That is why I invite you to share in the comments what resonated most with you. I read them all, and your story deserves to be heard. If this video touched you, share it with someone who may need it. Addiction thrives in silence, but a single message can crack open isolation. And if you wish to continue this journey, subscribe. This is not just a channel, it is a space for awakening, for people willing to face themselves and grow together. You have walked through pain, you have looked into the shadow, and now you stand at the threshold of something new. Rebirth is not perfection, it is learning to live whole, to inhabit your life with presence and compassion. And as you step forward, remember this, the cracks you carry are not your shame. They are the places where your soul already shines.